welcome to Wild Old Times, a podcast about the strange and curious corners of Ireland and Irish history. My name is Ciaran Conliffe, and today I'd like to talk to you about the origins of Irish cinema. Nowadays, the island of Ireland is known both as a filming location and a place where films and TV are made, punching above its weight with shows like Game of Thrones and films like The Banshees of Inisherin. But it was nearly 130 years ago, back in 1897, that the Lumiere brothers first put Ireland on the silver screen with a set of pieces they filmed in our city streets. One of the shorts they shot was an everyday view of O'Connell Street, or Sackville Street as it was known then, possibly the oldest film footage of Ireland surviving, which lends it a certain haunting quality. If you go looking for it online, though, you might be misled. Another piece they shot the same year was of a fire brigade rolling out to respond to a call in Belfast. For some reason, a badly colorized version of this, claiming to be taken on Grafton Street, is very popular on Facebook and other such places. To save your confusion, I'll leave links to both of the genuine articles in the show notes, along with any other films I referenced today that you can find online. Although this was the first time something was filmed in Ireland, the people of Dublin were already familiar with the medium. Showings of silent films in music halls were a popular attraction, though it would be some time until it got a permanent cinema. In fact, the first cinema was built in Dublin in 1909 by one of the wildest Irish personalities, James Joyce. Joyce deserves his own episode, and maybe one day he'll get one, but he passes through this one while he was living in Austria in 1909. Cinemas had arrived in Europe 4 years earlier, the first being built in Paris, naturally enough. That September, Joyce got into conversation with a group of Slovenian investors. He told them that he knew of a city of 500,000 people with not one cinema, Dublin. At the time, Vienna had a population of 2 million people and had 60 cinemas. Joyce offered to set the cinema up and manage it in exchange for 10% of the profits. The investors liked the idea, and so he went back to Dublin and bought an old store on Mary Street, which became Dublin's first movie theatre, the Volta. We still have the programme for the Volta's opening night, which was a complete sellout. The films were titled on-screen in Italian, as that was where Joyce sourced the reels, so programmes with English translations were handed out to the crowd. The opener was The Haunted Castle, directed by Segundo Shimon. This is a short movie, where two knights venture into the titular haunted castle and rescue a young woman from demons. Shimon was a prolific creator of shorts, most of which were fantastical in nature and leaned heavily on the special effects of the era. There were 4 other shorts in the first programme, with one of the most notable being a historical film about Beatrice Cenci. Beatrice was an Italian noblewoman of the 16th century who was imprisoned for murdering her father. The general public held street protests in support of her, because it was well known that she had been driven to it by her father's physical and sexual abuse. Despite this, Pope Clement VIII executed the young woman along with almost the entire rest of her family. Their estates were also confiscated, and coincidentally wound up as part of the Pope's personal property. Beatrice's story became a rallying cry for the poor of the city against the corrupt nobility, and after the rebellions of 1848, versions of the tale became a popular way for artists to express their sympathy for the movement. It was a bold and controversial choice, and exactly the sort of thing Joyce would decide to drop in his hometown. This was long before Joyce became famous, though, so it's doubtful any of the people thronging the cinema even knew the name of the manager. The cinema was initially a huge success, although Joyce tired of it after a few months. He wrote disparagingly about the rowdy behaviour of the patrons, especially the children. Once the novelty wore off, the numbers soon fell. Joyce handed off the reins to another one of the investors and headed back to Trieste in January of 1910, and the cinema did not last long after that. Faced stiff competition from new rival cinemas, as well as the old vaudeville halls. The growing dominance of American cinema meant that the European imports couldn't compete. Cinema was sold off to a British company, and continued operating on and off until 1948. And in 1910, it was one of the cinemas that showed the first ever motion picture filmed in part in an Irish location, Sidney Alcott's The Lad from Old Ireland. Sidney Alcott was born in Toronto in 1873 and moved to New York to become an actor. After appearing on stage for several years, he made his film debut in 1904. Movie companies at the time were much like tech startups today, frantic places where people with talent and an unhealthy work ethic could do well. By 1907, Sidney had been hired by Callum to direct and star in his own movies. One of the first he made was also the first adaptation of the novel Ben-Hur, featuring the classic chariot race scene. The adaptation was written by Jean Gontier. Jean was as multi-talented as Sidney. She wrote the screenplays for most of Callum's movies, but also starred in a lot of them as an actress. There were a lot of female screenwriters in those days, which might be why they've never got as much respect as directors. But speaking of the novel, it was still in copyright at the time, and Sidney's company Callum hadn't bothered getting clearance for the film. So he also had the distinction of being at the centre of the first copyright lawsuit in the history of the movies. Despite this, the films he made were so successful that Callum's owners made him president and gave him a share in the business to stop him jumping ship. And in 1910, he and a film crew went to Ireland. The location Sidney Alcott chose to film in was the village of Beaufort in County Kerry. It was his first time in Ireland, and he fell in love with the place. He would return to Beaufort every summer until World War I made that impossible. The first film he shot was called, as I said earlier, The Lad from Old Ireland. It's a fairly basic premise. A young man emigrates from Ireland to New York, where he becomes successful. When he gets a letter from his childhood sweetheart that her family are being evicted, he is able to return home and save the day. It was a classic wish fulfillment trope aimed at the Irish immigrant community, and it was wildly successful. The fact that it allowed them to glimpse on film the land they had left behind might have been the biggest draw. The runaway success of the film was probably why he was back in Beaufort the following year, where he shot 4 films. The first was called Rory O'More, and was based on an old play by Samuel Lover. Rory O'More was a real historical figure who led a rebellion against the English in 1641 to try to reclaim lands stolen from his family by Queen Elizabeth generations earlier. Samuel Lover wrote a ballad about O'More that became a novel, that became a play. Incidentally, if you've ever played the video game BioShock Infinite, the Irish music that Elizabeth dances to comes from that ballad. Lover's version of the story drew heavily on the 1798 rebellion, and Sidney Alcott's film simply sets the story there. It was a fairly complicated film with a relatively large cast for the time, which might be why Sidney only directed it and did not star in it. He got in front of the camera for the second film he made that summer, which was a much simpler affair. It was called An Irish Honeymoon, and had him and Jean Gontier as a couple touring around the sights of County Kerry. Alcott made 2 more movies in Beaufort that summer. One was The Colleen Bawn, and was based on the tragic story of Ellen Scanlon. That's a tale I'll tell you another time. The 4th movie actually links back to a story I told you in a previous episode. It was called Aaron a Pogue, and was based on a play by Dion Boucachal, the son of Dionysus Lardner. It's a comedy of errors full of love triangles, and again featured Sidney and Jean both behind and in front of the camera. Sidney, Jean and the crew returned to Ireland in 1912, but it was just part of a longer journey. That year they travelled to the Middle East, where they shot multiple films in Egypt and Palestine. Among them was one of the longest films ever made at that time, a 71-minute movie called From the Manger to the Cross. This was a biopic of Jesus Christ that had scenes from the New Testament mixed with Bible verses and title cards. Jean wrote the screenplay and also starred as the Virgin Mary. With a cast of dozens, Sidney was mostly busy behind the camera, but found time to cameo as a blind man healed by Jesus. Jean's new husband, Jack Clark, also starred in the film as John the Baptist. Of course, the mere notion of making a film about Jesus was outrageous to many. A campaign against it by the Daily Mail in England, for example, was one of the factors that led to the British Board of Film Censorship being established. That didn't hurt the box office, though. Film was expensive to produce but made many times its budget back, over $1 million, a staggering amount for the time. However, neither Sidney nor Jean saw more than a fraction of it. Calum's bosses kept all the profits for themselves, which turned out to be a mistake. Both Gene and Sidney handed in their notice, and without them, the studio would only limp on for a few more years before being acquired. Gene started her own company and persuaded Sidney to join it. It was under that banner that they returned to Ireland in 1913, along with Jack Clark. Gene didn't come to Ireland with Sidney in 1914. Instead, he was accompanied by his new wife, Valentine Grant. Valentine was also a screenplay writer. Gene's company doesn't seem to have lasted long, and it would be completely undermined that year as she was visiting Germany when the war broke out. She was stuck there until 1918 and retired from acting shortly after. The war also put paid to Sidney's plan to create a permanent film studio in Ireland, based in Beaufort. It's one of those classic what-if scenarios, as it would have had a major impact on the Irish film industry. But it was not to be. Perhaps inspired by Sidney Alcott, the Irish immigrant Walter McNamara came to Ireland in 1914 to shoot his own historical epic. McNamara had been born in Waterford and emigrated to New York, but he followed news and events in his old homeland religiously. Like many, he was convinced that 1914 was the year that the British would restore Irish home rule, and that was the framework for his film, which is called Ireland, a Nation. It begins in 1800 with the passage of the Act of Union, the law that abolished the Irish Parliament. Noticeably, the figure it shows reacting in horror to this news is Father John Murphy, who was actually executed 2 years earlier after the 1798 rebellion. From that, you can probably tell that this was a film more intent on capturing emotions than historical accuracy. Still, it gives a good set of highlights of 114 years of Irish struggles, and even includes Daniel O'Connell's pistol duel that we've spoken about before, something that might have struck a chord with Americans who had their own dueling history. The film ends on a crowd shot of actual celebrating Irish nationalists who thought that home rule was about to be achieved. That was the atmosphere when the 54-minute movie was first shown in New York on the 22nd of September 1914. At the time, the war in Europe had begun, but no one had any idea what it was going to turn into. They soon found out. In addition to derailing home rule, the war also derailed the showing of Ireland, a Nation, in Ireland itself. Allegedly, the first copy of the film sent across the Atlantic was on board the Lusitania, the British ocean liner full of civilians that was torpedoed and sunk by a German submarine. It wasn't until April of 1916 that the film made it to Dublin, and in the aftermath of the Easter Rising, the film called Ireland, a Nation had a very different meaning. Martial law in the capital meant that the film couldn't be shown for nearly a year, and the government forced multiple cuts to be made before that. The poster campaign for the film in December 1916 provoked much debate among the public, some thinking the film didn't actually exist, and that this was a way to show a revolutionary slogan discreetly. On the 8th of January, it opened in the Rotunda, Dublin's largest cinema with a capacity of 1,500, for 1 week only. The film drew massive crowds, and police observers among them noted how they booed the British characters and cheered anything vaguely revolutionary. Because of this, they demanded further cuts to the film, but the audience on the 9th were even more animated than the first night. It was clear that the film had become a place to celebrate the concept of Ireland as a nation more than anything else, with rebel songs being sung over the closing credits. As a result, the film was banned throughout Ireland and its posters were covered over. This, of course, made it an even more potent symbol of Irish repression. It was because of these events that in 1922, after the Irish Free State was established, one Dublin cinema celebrated with a full and uncensored showing of the film. Up until now, filmmakers had always come to Ireland from America. It had no native film industry. The Film Company of Ireland was founded in 1916 to change that. It was the brainchild of Ellen Sullivan and her husband James. James Sullivan had been born in Kerry in 1873 and emigrated to America with his family when he was a child. In 1910, he returned to Ireland to deal with some family business. While there, he met Ellen. She was the daughter of Stephen O'Mara, a former mayor of Limerick. Ellen and James got married and seem to have initially lived in America. James was appointed as U.S. ambassador to the Dominican Republic in 1913 and served 2 years in the post, though he was recalled to Washington at least once. Apparently, he wasn't a very good ambassador. He and Ellen were back in Ireland by 1916, when in March they founded their movie company, along with some other investors. They made an agreement with the Abbey Theatre, where they could hire the theatre's regular actors as long as filming didn't interfere with stage work. The destruction of their office in the Easter Rising was only a minor setback, and in August they released their first silent short film. It was called O'Neill of the Glen, and it was directed by J.M. Kerrigan. The film was a success, and more shorts swiftly followed. Kerrigan emigrated to America in 1917, where he went on to star in over 100 movies before retiring in 1960. He was replaced as director by Fred O'Donovan, another stalwart of the Abbey stage. 1917 was also the year the film company almost fizzled out, as it had been struggling to turn a profit and declared bankruptcy. In September 1917, Ellen bought out the company and became sole personal owner. With that sorted, they began work on their first feature-length film. Ellen wrote an adaptation of the novel Knock na Gau, which had been written by the Irish nationalist Charles Kickham. It was about the oppression of the Irish peasants by their landlords, the unity of the people in the face of oppression. Ellen was a fervent nationalist, so the novel was perfect for her company. Fred O'Donovan directed the film, and it was shot on location in Tipperary. It's one of the few films made by the FCOI that survives. In 1918, Ellen and James went to America to find distributors for their films. They set up an office in Boston to manage the business there and returned to Ireland. Alas, tragedy was about to strike. In 1919, one of Ellen's 3 children became sick with typhoid fever. He died, and so did Ellen. She had caught the disease while nursing him. Without Ellen, James had no interest in the film company. He sold it and returned to America with his 2 surviving children. The Film Company of Ireland limped on, though without Ellen's drive and connections, it no longer had the same spark. They released one more feature-length movie in 1920, though it had been filmed before Ellen's death. It was called Willie Riley and His Colleen Bawn, and was based on a 19th century novel by William Carleton. This is no relation to the earlier film we mentioned called Colleen Bawn, by the way. Colleen Bawn just means blonde young woman in Irish. The film was set in Cavan in the 18th century, and is about a relationship between Willie Riley, a Catholic landowner, and a Protestant woman named Helen Folliard. Despite Helen's father owing Willie his life, he still demands that Willie convert if he wants to marry Helen. When Willie refuses, Helen's father makes plans to marry her off to the villainous Sir Robert Whitecraft. Sir Robert also conspires to steal Willie's land and to frame him as a thief. Willie ends up on the run, and the film makes a point of having him be sheltered by a Protestant clergyman who tells him that we are all fellow Irishmen. Willie and Helen elope, but they are captured. She is about to be forced into marriage with Sir Robert when the truth comes out about his crimes and he is arrested. Because of the elopement, Willie is sentenced to 7 years transportation for abducting Helen, but she waits for him, and when he returns, they are married. It's an interesting film. It reflects the mood of the time, especially the idea that the Irish needed to stand together against persecution. But it's even more interesting for what was going on behind the camera with its director, John McDonagh. John was a veteran of the 1916 Rising, and the brother of Thomas McDonagh, one of the leaders. John had been involved in show business for years and had toured in America in 1910 with the Moody Manners Opera Company. While there, he wrote a script for a short film called The Fugitive, set in the American Civil War, which was directed by the legendary D.W. Griffith. He joined the Irish Film Company in 1917 and tried his hand at directing himself, with a comedy short called Paying the Rent. Willie Riley was his first feature film. During its film, he also created a propaganda film for the IRA, showing Michael Collins signing the bonds to be used for fundraising for the cause. That film was smuggled to America and used to sell the bonds, which raised over $10 million. This money would turn into a major headache for the Irish Free State, but that's another story for another day. John left for Scotland right after the filming on Willie Riley was completed, allegedly in order to avoid being arrested for his propaganda film. By 1920, he was back in Dublin, managing the Irish Theatre Company and writing plays for them. In 1922, he returned to film, directing several comedies for the General Film Supply Company. This company had been set up in 1913 by Norman Whitten. Norman was an Englishman who had been working in film for over 10 years before he moved to Dublin and set up his company. GFS initially made mostly newsreels and advertisements, but they also were one of the claimants to making Ireland's first animated film. They most credit that to the Horgan brothers from Youghal in County Cork. Philip, James and Thomas Horgan ran a cinema in Youghal, and like a lot of cinema owners at the time, they also produced their own newsreels of local events. Back in 1910, they used a mixture of photographs and models to create a stop-motion animation of the Youghal town clock spinning on the spot, moving around, and even standing on its head. I'll link to the brothers' newsreels and the animated short in the show notes if you're interested. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to track down any details on the animated film that Norman Whitten made. His newsreel series was called Irish Events, and the footage that survives gives us an amazing window into this era. His main competition was Pathé News, a French company who dominated the UK newsreel scene. Norman's big advantage was that he had his own film processing facilities based in Dublin, whereas Pathé's British division were based in England and had to send their film back there to be processed. This meant that he was able to get his reels into the cinema the evening of the same day they happened. Naturally, covering the news meant that he was running into Irish nationalism. In 1917, he filmed the release of the men imprisoned in the aftermath of the Easter Rising. The next month, he filmed the Sinn Féin convention, where those men, led by Eamon de Valera, effectively co-opted the party and turned it into what the press had decided it was. Whitten was not an Irish nationalist, but he was giving honest coverage of controversial events. This led to him falling foul of the authorities in 1919, when one of his newsreels was seized and banned by the government. The newsreel was called Sinn Féin Review, and it was a compilation of various pieces of newsreel footage that Norman had made about Sinn Féin over the previous few years. Because it was almost all pre-existing footage, the government action seems to have caught Norman by surprise. It seems that his poster advertising the film, and that it included footage of Eamon de Valera, who was in hiding at the time, just happened to catch the attention of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. It was arbitrarily decided that the film was Sinn Féin propaganda, so it was banned and seized. One copy had already been sent out to a cinema in Drogheda, and the police raided the cinema to seize it. Sadly, no copies of the film survive, though we do have a detailed running order in the notes of the police who decided to censor it. The police also cast an eye over Norman Whitten's first feature film, which was in production, but luckily he had chosen a fairly uncontroversial subject. In the Days of St. Patrick tells the story of how Patrick was abducted to Ireland as a slave when he was young, his escape, joining the priesthood and returning to Ireland as a bishop. There are special effects such as him casting the snake's head of Ireland, and there are dramatic external shots as well as some studio work that has aged less well. Like many films of the time, the plot relies on the audience already knowing the story, but it did well in both Ireland and abroad. In 1922, Norman Whitten's company produced 3 comedy films starring Jimmy O'Day. Jimmy was one of the actors in John McDonagh's theatre company, and although he was only a part-time actor, he was clearly a gifted comedian. John wrote and directed all 3. One of them was called Crusceen Lawn, a name that means the little full jug and comes from an Irish drinking song. The film is about an old horse winning a race after being dosed with a magic potion. Another, Casey's Millions, is about the search in a rural Irish village for the heir to a fortune left behind by a rich Irish American. This is confounded by multiple people in the village having the surname Casey. 2 con artists use the confusion to pretend to be lawyers searching for the heir and take advantage of the townsfolk. The third was a short, Wicklow Gold, where a man persuades his father to let him marry his beloved by tricking him into thinking there is gold in her land. Sadly, all 3 films are lost media. Reportedly, they were all quite successful, which makes it surprising that the same year Norman Whitten decided to sell his business and move back to England. It might have been that the establishment of the Irish Free State disrupted his supply lines, and that as an Englishman he felt he'd face challenges in the new country. This was only one of several blows to the Irish film industry. The Film Company of Ireland officially closed the same year, having never recovered from Ellen Sullivan's death and her husband leaving both the company and the country. And the Celtic Film Company, a would-be rival that had been founded in 1917 by William Power, but only released a single feature film before closing down in 1920. That film was called Rosaleen Dhu, and it is sadly also lost to us. As the sun rose on a new Ireland in 1922, there were no native Irish film production companies. The Irish film industry would have to reinvent itself once more. That is another story. So join us next episode for part 2 of this wild old tale about the Irish film industry. This has been Wild Old Times, a podcast about the stranger corners of Ireland and Irish history. The opening theme is The Cat That Ate the Candle. The closing theme is The Parting Glass. Both were recorded by Gregory Mahan and are used under a Creative Commons license. You can find more of Greg's music at tinwhistler.com. Our logo is by Liffy Designs. Wild Old Times is recorded at Farset Labs in Belfast. If you enjoyed the podcast, give it a review wherever you find it. It really does help the show. If you really enjoyed it, tell your friends. Either way, I hope to see you again for another wild old time from Irish history.